In this section, we'll be discussing the architecture and layering our projects. We are going to take a look at the solution architecture overview, and then we'll proceed with creating our web API and core project. In this video, we'll take a look at the solution architecture overview, which means that we'll discuss the application architecture, and then we'll create a solution and all of the projects using the dotnet CLI. Personally, I am a big fan of a so-called onion architecture that was introduced by Jeffrey Palermo almost 10 years ago. If you take a look at its graph, it's quite simple. At the very core, you can see that there we have our models, domain, or entities. Then we have our domain services or repositories, and then when we go up and up, we have our application services, and finally things like user interface, web API, tests, and the external items such as databases, files, or web services. In our project that we named Kubo, we'll try to implement a very basic version of the onion architecture. Our project will actually allow user to create a new so-called bucket, and within each bucket, the user will be able to store an item which will hold a key and value object. So we can think of our application named Kubo as a simple key value data store. So we'll actually create two projects, one being the web API, which we can identify as this upper layer here, and one called core. And actually our core project will be these two or three layers inside. So like I said, we won't do many more projects like between our API and between our core. We'll just stick to the core and the API project. Alright, so once we have discussed our architecture, let's create our solution using the dotnet CLI. So here I'll open my terminal and I'll just create a new project. At first I'll create a new directory named Kubo. So I'll type mkdir Kubo. Then I can navigate to my directory, and here let's use the dotnet CLI to actually create our solution and our projects. So at first I can say .NET new sln -n and just name it Kubo. Then I will create a new folder. I will call it src, and I'll also create a new folder called tests. We'll be implementing tests later on, but for now it's good to have this folder already here. So now I will navigate into my src folder, and within the src I will create a new project, or actually two projects. The first one will be a new web API, so I will type .NET new web API, and I will name it kubo.api. The other one will be a class library, because our core project will not really have too many references. Ideally, if we stick to the onion architecture, our core project will only contain our domain models or some interfaces, and it would have no references at all. And then we'll have another project, let's say infrastructure, that will actually reference our core project, that in the end would be referenced by our API. But like I said, in this course or in this application, we only focus on these two projects. So let's create a new project of type classlib and name it kubo.core. Alright, so let's go up to the main directory and let's actually reference our project. So I can type .NET sln, and then I can say and I want to reference my two projects. So I will just type src, and then I need to provide a full path to the csproj. So this one, and also sln src kubo.core and the csproj file. And the last thing that I want to do is to actually navigate again to my src, and I want my Kubo API project to actually reference the Kubo core. So let's type .NET add, and then my API csproj file, so Kubo API csproj, then a keyword reference, and then my project that I want to reference, which will be core and again full path to the CSproj file. Now I can go up once again, and let's just execute .NET restore first. Okay, then I can call .NET build, our application builds, so we can just give it a try and see if our template web API works properly. So I'll just go into my SRC, into my API, and call .NET run. It started, so let's navigate to our localhost 5000 and the default endpoint of API/values. As you can see, our API works and it has properly referenced our core project. We can open the IDE now, so I'll use my Visual Studio Code. And here I can see that there is my SLN, my solution file, that actually references these two projects here, the API and the core. And within my API, I can take a look at the CSproj, and I can see that it references the core project, which is in this folder. So actually, this is how our solution will look like. Later on, like I said, we'll also include their test projects. And that's all about our solution and the application structure, and we can move further with actually implementing some code. In this video, you saw what is the Onion architecture and what type of architecture we are going to implement into our Kubo application. You also saw how you can create a solution and projects and reference them using the .NET CLI.